When Apple first opened orders for the new MacBook Pros, I was immediately dumbstruck and left in complete confusion when I saw just how many configurations were available on Apple's website for the 14-inch model. I mean, not only could you choose between things like 16, 32, and 64 gigabytes of unified memory, but there were also 5 separate CPU configurations, which I believe is the most CPU choices ever for a MacBook Pro. And with very little to go on in regards to how the M1 Pro and M1 Max performed, I was very nervous at the base model M1 Pro MacBook Pro, because here was a laptop that started at $2,000, one of the higher starting prices we've seen for a MacBook Pro, and it came with a weaker M1 Pro chip than what Apple was showing off at their event, with 2 less CPU cores and 2 less GPU cores. And when I first put my order in, I just didn't know what to expect here in terms of a performance difference, not only between last year's M1 Pro MacBook Pro, but also from the higher end configuration M1 computer with its 10-core CPU, and of course the Max chip version with its bigger and beefier 32-core GPU. Well, it's been interesting testing this version of the base model MacBook Pro because, believe it or not, this weaker CPU comes with disadvantages and advantages. But ultimately, I believe this version of the MacBook Pro is probably the one most people should buy. I kind of gave away the ending for this video. I'll probably give that away in the title too, but let me tell you why. I think that's kind of the important part. Now, at a glance, what you get with this machine is 512 gigabytes of storage and 16 gigabytes of memory and an 8-core M1 Pro chip, and this starts at $2,000. Now, before we go over the chip difference, let's just talk about everything else you get with this MacBook Pro, because besides the chip, thankfully, there is no differences with any of the other hardware choices between this base model 14-inch MacBook Pro and the more expensive chip configurations. That means the body is still the same, sporting a flatter, kind of more retro, modern design language that Apple products have kind of been moving in, but this MacBook Pro is definitely thicker. Just looking at it compared to its predecessor, side by side, it looks so much thicker. And it's heavier too, weighing 3.5 pounds, a half-pound increase over the old 13-inch Intel MacBook Pro. This does come with various advantages though, like the sides of the laptop are now adorned with a decent port selection of 3 Thunderbolt USB-C ports, a dedicated charging port with the MagSafe charging port, a headphone jack, an HDMI port, and for all things good in this world, an SD card slot. Thank you, Tim Cook. Now, honestly, all of the other ports are okay. Like, I kind of like having the MagSafe port for charging at night, especially knowing that if someone trips over the cable, it will pull out safely. I don't have to worry about the MacBook going crashing to the ground. And I also appreciate that you can still charge the MacBook Pro with any of the other USB-C ports just because of how ubiquitous USB-C cables are. So if I forgot to bring my MagSafe charger, or if I want to charge this from a battery bank, the power draw is low enough on the base model 14-inch that you can actually do that. But the biggest thing for me is that SD card slot. Like, I'm just so happy it's there because I record everything basically on SD cards from my camera that I'm looking at right now, and it's just so much easier to take that out and put it into my MacBook Pro and just start editing once I'm done with videos. It is a huge bonus to my workflow. I don't have to hunt down an adapter or a dongle. So really just happy with the SD card slot. That's really the only thing they could have brought back in terms of ports for me, and I would have been happy, but everything else is just gravy on top. Of course, there's other differences for this design, right? We're also getting a bigger 14-inch display with really reduced bezels on this MacBook Pro and an absolutely amazing mini LED ProMotion display. Editing with the 120 Hz refresh rate in Final Cut just feels so smooth. It feels more like a one-to-one interaction with the computer, and the way the display looks is quite frankly just beautiful, with really deep black levels and high brightness of up to 1600 nits for HDR video, which just makes the colors and highlights pop for extreme dynamic range. And I'll say this in every MacBook video I do, you really have to see one of these displays in person to notice just how good it looks. Looking at it on video isn't going to do it justice. Oh, and that notch? Believe me when I say it just disappears into the computer display. You never focus on it when you're using the laptop, and you only really notice it if you're like purposely looking for it. It's not a problem, trust me. If you're worried about the notch, I really don't think it's going to be a problem for anyone out there. Not only do you get the same display, you also get the same speakers on every 14-inch model, and these are probably the best laptop speakers out there, with the exception of the 16-inch model being just slightly better. But still, for the size of the 14-inch, The speakers produce rich, room-filling sound with deep bass, especially when you have the MacBook Pro on a hard surface, which just increases the overall resonance. So everything about this MacBook Pro, from the display to the speakers to things like the keyboard, which yes, it's now blacked out and I think it looks really nice. The typing experience is good and feels pretty much identical to that of the last generation MacBook Pro. However, the function key row, well, actually now there is a function key row. Last generation MacBook Pros had a touch bar, but the function key row compared to the MacBook Air is now bigger. And then the dedicated Touch ID sensor is now kind of housed in a bigger button as well. And Touch ID is still fast. It allows for fast unlocking of the Mac, although honestly, I still would have preferred something like Face ID. Hopefully that comes in a future iteration. But listen, I don't want to belabor this point. Everything about this 14-inch base model is the same as the more expensive configurations, from the display to the speaker to the 1080p webcam. Like, everything's the same, which is good, because sometimes Apple will make a base model cheaper and then start to skimp out on some of the components inside the laptops. Like, there's some sort of hidden changes here, but really this time, the only real difference here is the CPU, which is weaker. It's an 8-core CPU and then a 14-core GPU. Now, right up front, is the 8-core CPU weaker? Yes, obviously it is. Listen, for everyday use, you'll be hard-pressed to notice the difference between an M1 Pro 8-core CPU and a 10-core M1 Pro or M1 Max system. For most tasks that you do every day, they perform similarly, and honestly, even the regular M1 feels just as snappy for basic, everyday tasks. But this is a Pro machine, and Pro machines are supposed to go beyond the everyday, and real-world professionals use these machines to make money, and sometimes time is money. But is it enough of a time savings to justify that extra upfront money cost? And that is something you're gonna have to try and figure out for your own workflow based on what I have to tell you next. All right, so how much weaker is this 8-core CPU? Well, if you look at something like Geekbench, the 8-core CPU model is still incredibly powerful, scoring above 10,000 in my highest run of Geekbench for multi-core performance. For reference, that's more powerful than the base model 2019 Mac Pro, a full desktop tower, a 2017 10-core iMac Pro, which was no slouch, and even more powerful than last year's fully spec'd out 2020 iMac with the highest Intel 10-core chip available for it. So it's all perspective. Yes, the 10-core M1 Pro is faster, but this 8-core version in benchmark after benchmark is really powerful, more powerful than a lot of the machines released last year, and it really shows its capabilities in multi-core performance. It is a step up from the regular M1 chip. There's also a step up GPU-wise, and this is a bigger upgrade here on the 14-core model compared to the older 8-core M1 chip, and it scores much better on benchmarks and in gaming tests. For example, on Aztec Ruins on the high-tier off-screen benchmark, the 14-core actually scores pretty close to the fully binned 16-core M1 Pro chip. Now yes, these are artificial benchmarks, but these numbers are easily comparable against existing chips in other systems, so you can kind of take this information and see if this will be an upgrade over your existing system, or how much of an upgrade it will be over your existing system, and whether or not you should spend more money. And in most cases, the base model M1 Pro 8-core against a 10 model M1 Pro perform pretty similarly for what I do, especially for video editing and exporting, thanks to the dedicated H.264 and ProRes video encoders on these M1 Pro chips, making export times almost identical on both M1 Pro versions. However, I also have the Max version of the chip, so let's take a worst case scenario and pit it against the best case scenario. And what I mean by that is, let's take the M1 Pro 8-core and put it against the M1 Max 10-core CPU with a 32-core GPU. Now, obviously, a fully binned M1 Pro is the same CPU power as a fully binned M1 Max. The only real difference here is GPU performance. So CPU tasks like Geekbench or Cinebench are going to give you around the same performance, so we don't have to really go over that again. But if we look at the GFX benchmark that we ran before, we can see quite a jump in GPU performance on that 32-core GPU model. I also did a video export test to measure the increase in the media encoders in the M1 Max versus the M1 Pro. So first I exported a 16-minute real-world 4K project to ProRes, and the 14-inch M1 Max exported this in 1 minute and 54 seconds, while the base model 14-inch exported it in about 3 minutes. So for export time, at least if you deal with ProRes, you're only saving a minute in export times for a $700 chip upgrade. Now again, everyone's doing different work. If you're a developer, if you're in music production, if you're doing 3D modeling, different chip configurations might make more sense for you, but I can only speak to my experience, and for something like this, there's not that big of a difference. Again, I did this test twice to confirm the speeds, and they more or less exported around the same time, with no fan noise that I could at least hear audibly. Then I did another export test, this time with H.264, and again, the M1 Max here was much faster, exporting this 4K project in 4 minutes and 51 seconds, and we saw a bigger difference here with H.264 footage because the base model took 7 minutes and 52 seconds. So yeah, you can definitely get more performance on a M1 Max, but depending on your workflow and what you do on your laptop, it may or may not benefit you. And for it to be really worth the cost, you probably have to be doing really GPU intensive tasks like 3D modeling. Now, while you might think the M1 Max was better at everything, there was one thing I noticed when running these benchmarks where the M1 Max performed worse, and that was with battery life. Now, admittedly, this wasn't a full battery drain test, so you can take this with a grain of salt. But I started both of these laptops off at 100% and had the screen brightness set 4 brightness clicks from max brightness. Both laptops ran the same benchmarks, and when I was done testing all of these benchmarks, the M1 Max had 60% battery life remaining, while the M1 Pro 8-core had 66% battery life remaining. Not a huge difference, but I estimate over even more benchmarks and testing over a prolonged period of time, I think you would at least see a 10% difference in overall battery life remaining, possibly even more, and I would estimate at least an overall 1 hour improvement in overall battery life in a varied workflow on this base model MacBook Pro, and that's being pretty conservative with my estimate. So battery life on this 14-inch 8-core M1 Pro is probably going to be the best out of any of the other 14-inch models, just because it has a 8-core CPU and a 14-core GPU, so it's gonna draw less power than even a fully binned M1 Pro. And when you take a step back and look at all the hardware gains you get with the base model, from the mini LED display, to the amazing speakers, to the increased ports, to the still outstanding performance with even better battery life, for this laptop at $2,000, I really think this is the laptop that most people should get, and you really should only upgrade to the higher-end M1 Pro or Max chips if you know you can take advantage of that extra multi-core performance, and only really get the Max chip if you're really dealing with intensive GPU applications. Like, the main thing I want you to take away from this video is that the base model is still a screamer. It is still a top-tier performer, even with that lower bin chip. In fact, if you don't care about performance, these laptops probably aren't for you, and you'd probably be better off with a product like an M1 MacBook Air. However, I do get it. Like, I get the appeal of these machines. They have a lot of nice hardware specs going for it beyond performance, and listen, there's a lot of quality of life improvements with the more ports, the webcam, the speaker, the display. I keep repeating that, but it is true. So obviously, if you don't care about performance and you just want those other niceties, well, make sure you get the base model. Everything else, these other chips, they would totally just be wasted on you. They'd be wasted on most people. Either way, I think the base model 14-inch MacBook Pro is definitely worth it. And on top of that, if you spec out the M1 MacBook Pro similarly to the M1 Pro MacBook Pro, there's really only a $300 difference separating these computers. And I think the 14-inch is a much better overall laptop, where if you are speccing it out with 512GB SSD and 16 gigabytes of memory, I think I would just recommend spending the extra $300 to step up to the 14-inch model. All right, hopefully you found this video helpful, and if you did, be sure to leave me a like. If you want to see more from the channel, make sure you're subscribed, and if you want to help the channel out, like maybe buying this MacBook Pro, like maybe I convince you to buy the base model, make sure you check out either the tagged products or my affiliate links in the description below. And as always, thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care, everyone.